Hey folks, how's it going? This is Mike. Welcome back to my channel, and let me wish you all a happy new year. I hope everyone is starting off 2021 with positive vibes and hope for the future, and things will get better. I believe it. They will get better this year. So I'd like to get back to the series of a century of film favorites, and this time I'm going to be talking about the decade of the 1960s. Okay, so now a lot of things I want to say about the 60s, and I don't want to say too much because I'll be here for 2 hours and you'll all be asleep. So, the 1960s, very tumultuous decade for so many reasons politically, um, socially, sexually. I mean, the sexual revolution was heating up. We were all heating up, quite frankly. But yeah, tragic assassinations in that decade. And it seemed like everything we had believed as a society and as a culture was just being turned up on completely turned up on its head. And I think by the end of the decade, we were all kind of shell shocked by the whole thing. But and the film industry was caught up in the same kind of turmoil because they were at the beginning of the decade. Old Hollywood was still very much in force. In fact, so many of the great stars from the all the way back to the 20s, really, a lot of them were still alive. Many of them were still working, and it was a fascinating time. It was also um, the big studio system in America was in a state of decline and had been since the post-war period, 1946, 47, and it was made even worse by the rise of television in the 1950s. And it's interesting to me that even though television was such a stumbling block for the studio system, it's only because of television that people in my generation, that first generation that grew up with television, the only reason we ever knew anything about old Hollywood and those classic films is because we saw them on television. And the studios, in order to make money, they were selling large um, sections of their catalogs to be shown on television. And so we had a chance to see the great stars of the 40s and 50s, 30s when they were young, and we also saw many of them as they were in the 60s when they were still working. We saw them when they were 50, 60 years old. We saw them when they were 20. So it was an interesting time to grow up. And I'm very grateful that I grew up in that era, that we got to see those old movies on television in a way that the generation now doesn't really get that chance. They don't get that connection unless they live in a house where their parents watch Turner Classic Movies 24/7. A lot of these young people will never see these old movies probably, and they may not even be interested in seeing them. So hopefully a lot of them eventually will get that interest. Okay, so let me stop babbling. 1960, the best picture of the year was The Apartment, directed by Billy Wilder. Great film. We also had this epic film produced and directed by John Wayne, The Alamo. He also starred in the film. So we begin the decade with John Wayne, the image of the great American hero, the cowboy, the soldier, and very good film that I remember seeing with my family. All right. That year we also had this great film directed by Vincent Minnelli. Robert Mitchum and Eleanor Parker in Home from the Hill. Very serious soap opera with George Hamilton and George Peppard, I think. Yeah, the two Georges playing brothers. One is legitimate, one is not legitimate, and that's all the trouble. Yeah, George Hamilton and George Peppard. Very good movie. All right, 1961. We start with John Huston directing Clark Gable, Marilyn Monroe, Lawrence Harvey in no, not Lawrence Harvey. Um, what is that guy's name? Montgomery Clift. I was thinking of, I was getting those two mixed up. That's crazy. Montgomery Clift. In this very depressing film, directed by, well, I just said it was directed by John Huston, written by Arthur Miller, who was married to Miss Monroe at the time. And very sadly, this is the last film for both Gable and Monroe. A difficult film, not exactly 100% successful, but fascinating to watch for many, many reasons. Okay. Also that year, we have this film directed by William Wyler, The Children's Hour, starring Shirley MacLaine, Audrey Hepburn, and James Garner, in a film that's based on a play by Lillian Hellman about a lesbian relationship. Now, it's probably one of the, I think it probably was the first film, at least the first American film, that addressed this particular issue, and it's done with very great sensitivity. Another downer of a film showing the sort of trend that was beginning in the 1960s to have something other than a happy ending, right? But still a fascinating film to watch. Also that year we have this great film, Something Wild, starring Carol Baker and Ralph Meeker, about a young woman who is sexually assaulted, and it just changes her life overnight. Another very strange film, but also worth seeing. All right. And here's a film that I like very much, a low-budget independent film that I've talked about before, A Cold Wind in August, directed by Alexander Singer, starring a beautiful Lola Albright as a stripper in New York City who is very sexy, very confident, and she decides on a whim to seduce the 17-year-old son of her landlord. And the son is played by Scott Marlowe. And nothing graphic about it. It's all very suggestive, but it's definitely something that's ahead of its time about a woman who is so sexually aggressive, and especially going after a much younger boy. And it's not as creepy as it sounds, because Scott Marlowe was almost as old as Lola Albright, but looked a little bit younger. Both actors gave good performances. All right, now we get to 1962. Now, old Hollywood was in a state of decline, and was reflected by a lot of books that were being written at the time. And one book that was made into a classic film, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, starring Bette Davis and Joan Crawford, in a film about two actresses from the 1930s, which of course both of these women were, and they were sisters. And they were living in seclusion in an old Hollywood mansion with all kinds of family secrets and hatreds and arguments and all sorts of things. And just a fascinating film to watch. Okay, now here's a low-budget film from Roger Corman, which a lot of people don't talk about. This is The Intruder, starring, who is that guy? William Shatner, right? William Shatner. And it's all about, he plays a guy from the north who goes down to a southern city that has just been forced to integrate their schools, and he gets people all riled up in racial terms and tries to start violence. And it's a fascinating film, and covers a subject that is relevant even today. All right, so, and also 1962, another very depressing movie that talks about the American military and changing feelings about the country and politics, The Manchurian Candidate. Now we really have Lawrence Harvey. Lawrence Harvey, Frank Sinatra, Janet Leigh, and Angela Lansbury. Fantastic film. But again, very depressing. 1963, Beach Party. You knew I was going to talk about this. I can't help it. Bob Cummings, Dorothy Malone, Frankie Avalon, and Annette Funicello, the first of a long series of very silly, very low budget, very quickly made beach party movies. This is absolutely the best. And it's got two adult stars being top billed, and then after that, Frankie and Annette took over for the rest of the series. I would say this is probably the only one you really have to watch, and you can enjoy this on a level just instead of thinking about the rest of the series. This is pretty well done. Okay. Next up, we have Judy Garland in her very last film performance, I Could Go On Singing, co-starring Dirk Bogarde. Great dramatic film. Very good acting by both of these people. Judy Garland is fantastic. And she also does all the music on her own, and she gives a great singing performance as well. So, next up, in 1963, I had to say something about this classic horror film, The Haunting. Julie Harris, Claire Bloom, and directed by Robert Wise. There's just nothing else like it. Great. And here's a film I love to talk about that nobody else seems to care about. The Sadist, a low-budget film from 1963 starring Arch Hall Jr. And it's just something I recommend highly because I think it's very well done. So I like it. 1964, that was the year I became a teenager. And we have to start off with A Hard Day's Night by the Beatles. Now, true story, I did not go to see this movie with the rest of my generation. I don't know why I didn't, but I didn't. Even though I became a Beatle fan like everybody else, but I did not see this movie until maybe 10 years ago when I picked this up. And it's a great film. And it's another one of those movies that sort of took the culture and the cinema a little bit forward, right? 1964 also gave us this very violent film, The Naked Kiss, starring Constance Towers, and it's directed by Samuel Fuller, who was known for making some very provocative films, and this certainly is aptly described as provocative. So, all right. Next up is now going back to the idea that old Hollywood is still very much with us, even when we have heavy stuff like this. The same year, we also have My Fair Lady, based on the Broadway musical that was very successful. Beautiful music in the film, Audrey Hepburn, Rex Harrison, but it's very stagey, and it's not terribly exciting in a way. I guess that's the best way to describe it, but certainly it's a classic in its own right. Okay, now we get up to the year 1965, and Hollywood was still in the process of deconstructing itself with a film called Inside Daisy Clover, starring Natalie Wood playing a young girl who goes to Hollywood and becomes a famous movie star, a singer as a child. Natalie Wood was in her late 20s at this time, but she looked young enough where you could almost go into the illusion that she was sort of like the age of 14 or 15, like Judy Garland was, and Deanna Durbin. So what they want to do is make you think of those old child stars, but they have a very cynical and very hard-hitting way of looking at that whole thing. It was actually filmed inside of they used Hollywood locations, the studios and all that, and it's just kind of a Hollywood looking at itself and saying, yeah, there really is some ugliness here. Let's show it on screen. But it's actually a pretty good movie. Okay. Next up, after the Beatles did A Hard Day's Night, another English rock group that was very popular, the Dave Clark Five, put out something called Having a Wild Weekend, which certainly is not on the same level as A Hard Day's Night, but it's not bad. It's a very interesting little film that was very serious in tone, whereas A Hard Day's Night was done for comedy. This had a lot of serious moments in it, and it was quite good, quite interesting to watch. So I would recommend that people see it, just out of curiosity. Something else in 1965, Russ Meyer, Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, which is about as off the wall as you can get, as far away from old Hollywood as you could possibly get, starring the unbelievable and totally irreplaceable Tura Satana. So a friend of mine said, no, I sent away for some other movies from a guy online. He sent me this just as an extra, so I had never seen it before. A very interesting movie. But the biggest film in 1965 was also one of the biggest films of the decade, and that was The Sound of Music, starring Julie Andrews. A beautiful, beautiful film, which also I've only seen once in my life. Did not see it back in the day. Saw it maybe 8 or 10 years ago when it was revived on the big screen. And it was a big, big, influential film in Hollywood because the studios were just dying to imitate it and imitate that success. And it didn't always work out that way. So unfortunately, it was kind of a blessing and a curse for the Hollywood studios. So what do you make of a decade that in 1965 gave you The Sound of Music, and then a year later gave you this? John Frankenheimer's Seconds, starring Rock Hudson. One of the most downbeat, depressing movies about the death of the American dream that you could ever possibly see. It's a fantastic movie. Again, this is not something that I saw back in the day. I bought this at Borders Bookstore one night when I just happened to be looking through their DVD selection, and I remember this poster that I used to see on marquees or see in the newspaper, and it just caught my eye. So it's a fascinating film to watch. All right. Also, 1966, we have the beginning of the biker films at American International. This is directed by Roger Corman, starring Peter Fonda, Nancy Sinatra, Bruce Dern, and Diane Ladd, and based on the Hells Angels, and a very strange film. It gets really downbeat and creepy at some moments, but it's kind of fun in a way. All right. Next up, speaking of angels, we also have this the beautiful, sweet movie called The Trouble with Angels, starring Haley Mills and Rosalind Russell. It's all about a a Catholic girls' school and the antics of two girls who were very rebellious. The other rebellious girl is played by an actress named June Harding, who was very good. And this is another sort of a standard kind of old Hollywood movie, but yeah, very, very interesting and quite different than the way the angels are portrayed here. So, all right. And what do you make of the decade that also gave you Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Liz Taylor and Richard Burton made this film, and this is the film that finally put the last nail in the coffin for the censorship. It all changed after this, okay, because of this. Next up in 1967, we have, of course, The Graduate, a fantastic movie that seems to change every time I watch it. I watched this, I did go to see this in 1967 when I was 16, and it seems like a different movie now when I watch it as an adult, because you look at these two people who were thought of as being such countercultural heroes at the time. You look at them now at the end of the movie and you realize that they're going to end up exactly like their parents, just like we all did. Okay. Also, one of my favorite films from that year, The Incident, which is all about, it talks about the graphic violence in New York City, takes place on a subway. You have people like Martin Sheen, Tony Musante playing these two maniacs who get on a subway and terrorize everybody on the train, and won't let them get off at the stops. So you have Beau Bridges and Thelma Ritter. Gary Merrill is in it. Great film. I like it very much. All right. Also in 1968, you had this interesting movie. Now we're up to 68. Okay, sorry. Once again, old Hollywood is asserting itself. Fred Astaire comes back to dance one more time in this movie called Finnish Rainbow, along with Petula Clark, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. Not a great film, but also not bad. The same year gave you this very strange movie, Targets, starring Boris Karloff, directed by Peter Bogdanovich, who also acts in the film. And it's all about the escalating climate of violence in society. It takes this sort of juxtaposes the story of this aging actor who specializes in horror films, and he is confronted by the modern horror of violence in society. It's a fascinating film, okay? John Cassavetes, the director and actor, began to come into his own with this very well-received movie called Faces, starring his wife Jenna Rollins, also John Marley, Seymour Cassel. 1968 also had this film that was very popular, another American International classic, called Wild in the Streets, starring Christopher Jones and Shelley Winters, all about a young rock singer who becomes involved in politics and it becomes president of the United States. Very, very interesting. But they pass a law that they lower the voting age to 14, and that means that all the kids get to have what they want, right, or what they think they want. Very interesting movie. Also that year, here's a classic film. I really love this film. And it's another one I didn't see until fairly recently, and I thought it was going to be long and a little bit boring, but it wasn't. It was just dynamic from start to finish. I think this is a beautiful example of how they could make a musical and do it well. All right. So in 1969, we're up to the end of the decade. Martin Scorsese made his first movie starring Harvey Keitel, Zena Bethune. Who's That Knocking at My Door? Very well made and interesting film. I think it's one of his best, actually. I like the way it looks. Black and white cinematography. Here is a movie that they probably didn't need to make, or at least in the way that they did. Hello, Dolly, starring Barbara Streisand and Walter Matthau. I guess they thought that the Broadway play had been so successful, they wanted to make a movie and use the new star of the moment, Barbara Streisand. But I think this is a really irritating and boring film. So I've watched it once, and I doubt if I will ever watch it again. Then we have Easy Rider, starring Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda, directed by Dennis Hopper, which another countercultural masterpiece for all of us who were believing in this kind of thing at the time. It's still a very effective movie, very well done. Liza Minnelli began her career as an actress with a very good dramatic performance in this film called The Sterile Cuckoo. Still very effective and very much worth seeing. All right. We said goodbye to what's his name? Elvis Presley. Yes. as an actor with his last theatrical film, Change of Habit, co-starring Mary Tyler Moore. And this takes a lot of abuse, and a lot of people criticize it. I actually like this movie. I did go to see this when it came out, and I liked it very much. So the movie that made Best Picture of the Year was Midnight Cowboy, Dustin Hoffman and Jon Voight, which takes the whole idea of the cowboy and turns that on its head as well. Very depressing, downbeat film, but still a great film to watch. And it's interesting that even though this was the Best Picture of the Year, we end the decade with John Wayne as we began, because he won Best Actor for True Grit, which is a film that I don't have. But so even at the end of 1969, which is a crazy decade to live in, we had John Wayne winning Best Actor. So that's the end of the 1960s. Sorry I kept you for almost 21 minutes. I apologize for that. Comments are welcome.